In the autumn of 1943, beneath the perpetual shroud of volcanic cloud that hung over Simpson Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Army believed it had built the one place in the Pacific where the war would finally be decided on its own terms. Rabaul, on the northeastern tip of New Britain, was no longer merely a port or an airfield complex. It had become a living organism of concrete, steel, and human conviction, home to 110,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen who were certain that history had already chosen this ground for the decisive battle of the Pacific War. 500 aircraft sat dispersed in revetments carved from jungle and lava rock. 400 heavy coastal guns peered out from caves that had taken 2 years to blast into the cliffs. Beneath the volcanoes, tunnels stretched for kilometers, some so deep that American intelligence estimated the lowest levels lay 30 meters below sea level, safe from any bomb yet invented. On paper, Rabaul was the strongest fortress the world had ever seen. In reality, it was already obsolete, and the men inside it did not yet understand why. Japan's entire strategy for defending the Pacific rested on a doctrine older than the Imperial Navy itself. Ever since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Japanese planners had dreamed of a single, annihilating clash that would destroy the enemy fleet and force a negotiated peace. The castle towns of the samurai era had simply been translated into coral and concrete. Hold the outer perimeter, absorb the first furious assault, bleed the attacker until his political will collapsed, then counterattack with the main battle fleet for the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle that would end the war in a day of blood and glory. Rabaul was designed to be the anvil. Truk, 400 miles to the north, would be the hammer. Between them, the American advance would be crushed exactly as Port Arthur had been crushed 4 decades earlier. General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army, understood the theory better than most. A tall, thoughtful man who had studied at the French École de Guerre and spoke fluent German, Imamura was no blind believer in the rhetoric flowing from Tokyo. He had privately warned Imperial General Headquarters that the Americans were not the Russians of 1905, that their industrial power was on a scale Japan could not match, and that a prolonged war would end in catastrophe. His warnings were filed and ignored. His orders remained clear. Turn Rabaul into a fortress so formidable that the Americans would have no choice but to assault it frontally, and there, on prepared ground, the war would be won. Imamura obeyed. By the middle of 1943, more than 100,000 men, many of them veterans transferred from the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, were digging, mixing concrete, and planting vegetable gardens on the volcanic slopes as insurance against siege. Every day, the sound of dynamite echoed through the caldera as new tunnels were blasted deeper into the rock. Japanese engineers, shirtless and glistening with sweat, worked by the light of kerosene lanterns, carving out hospitals, ammunition depots, command centers, even a cinema. Coastal artillery pieces, stripped from old battleships, were winched into caves whose embrasures had been calculated to the last minute of arc. 5 separate airfields, Lakanai, Vunakanau, Rapopo, Tabera, and Karavat, were ringed with revetments and protected by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. Rice for a full year and ammunition for longer were stacked in caverns that stayed cool even when the equatorial sun turned the surface into an oven. Young pilots practiced takeoffs and landings on strips cut through palm forests, confident that when the American fleet finally appeared on the horizon, they would rise in perfect formation and tear the enemy apart before a single Marine set foot ashore. Tokyo radio called Rabaul the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the South Pacific. Propaganda newsreels showed smiling soldiers waving from the cockpits of New Zero fighters, while newspapers back home assured families that the co-prosperity sphere now rested on an unbreakable shield. Imperial headquarters promised that when the Americans came, Admiral Yamamoto's successors would bring the combined fleet south for the final battle. All Rabaul had to do was hold long enough. The soldiers believed it. The engineers believed it. Even General Imamura, who doubted everything else, believed that if the Americans were foolish enough to attack Rabaul head-on, the slaughter would be so appalling that Washington would be forced to the negotiating table. What none of them yet understood was that across the Pacific, in a conference room at Pearl Harbor, American planners were studying the same intelligence summaries and reaching a very different conclusion. They saw the photographs taken by high-altitude reconnaissance planes, the new runways, the tunnel entrances, the endless lines of anti-aircraft positions. They read the intercepted radio traffic and the prisoner interrogations. They knew exactly how many men were inside the Rabaul perimeter, how much rice had been stockpiled, how many aircraft were serviceable on any given day. And in October 1943, in the humid stillness of a staff briefing, someone finally asked the question that would unravel everything Japan had built. Do we actually need to take Rabaul at all? The room went quiet. Officers who had spent their careers planning amphibious assaults looked at the map as if seeing it for the first time. Rabaul was not just strong, it was perfectly positioned to dominate the Bismarck Sea, to interdict any advance toward the Philippines, to threaten every Allied move in the South Pacific. For 2 years, American strategy had assumed that Rabaul would have to be captured or destroyed. Now, for the first time, the possibility existed that it could simply be ignored. On the cliffs above Simpson Harbor, a Japanese sentry stood at his post as the sun dropped into the Solomon Sea. His rifle was clean, his uniform pressed, his orders unambiguous. Somewhere behind him, in caverns lit by swaying bulbs, 110,000 men waited with absolute discipline for the battle that would decide their empire's fate. They had built the perfect fortress. They had prepared for every contingency their doctrine allowed. They were ready to die where they stood. But in war, strength means nothing if the enemy never shows up. November 20th, 1943. Dawn at Tarawa Atoll, Bedio Island. The first gray light revealed a lagoon already streaked with burning landing craft and the bodies of young men who had been alive 5 minutes earlier. By the time the sun cleared the palm stumps, the United States Marine Corps had discovered exactly how expensive the new Japanese defensive system could be. 2,000 yards of coral reef had been turned into a killing box. Low tide trapped the Higgins boats on the reef. Marines waded waist-deep under interlocking fire from machine guns that had been zeroed in months earlier. Hidden 8-inch Vickers guns, sold to Japan by the British in another era, fired from steel turrets buried in sand. Every coconut log bunker was mutually supporting. Every approach had been measured and pre-registered. In 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division lost 1,009 dead and 2,101 wounded to take an island smaller than Central Park. The Japanese garrison of 4,836 men fought almost literally to the last bullet. Only 17 surrendered alive. When the news reached Washington and Pearl Harbor, it detonated like a depth charge inside every planning staff. President Roosevelt was shown the first photographs of the abattoir on Baitio's beaches, and reportedly turned away without a word. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, stared at the casualty lists and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked a question that every senior officer in the Pacific already dreaded. If Tarawa costs 3,000 casualties, what will Rabaul cost? The answers came back within days, and they were unbearable. Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, Nimitz's war plans officer, assembled the estimates in a locked room at Pearl Harbor. The map on the wall was covered with red arrows converging on Rabaul like veins feeding a tumor. Sherman's team used the Tarawa ratios as the baseline and scaled them upward. Rabaul was not 2 square miles of flat coral. It was 200 square miles of jungle, mountain, and volcanic crater. The garrison was not 4,800 men. It was 110,000. The defensive works were not measured in hundreds of bunkers. They were measured in thousands, many carved into cliffs that made direct assault impossible. The preliminary casualty estimate for a frontal amphibious assault, even with overwhelming naval gunfire and air support, came back at between 18,000 and 25,000 American dead and wounded in the first week alone. A second staff study, this one from MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane, quietly raised the figure to 40,000 if the Japanese fought the way they had at Tarawa. No one in the room believed the American public would accept another Tarawa multiplied by 20. The ghosts of the first winter of the war, Bataan, Wake, and the Java Sea, were finally being exorcised. Victory was in sight. But victory purchased at that price would shatter the national will as surely as defeat. In the silence that followed the briefing, Captain James L. Holloway, one of Nimitz's operations officers, spoke the thought that had been growing in every mind since the first Tarawa photographs arrived. "Gentlemen," he said, "we keep assuming that every Japanese stronghold has to be reduced before we can move on. What if that assumption is wrong?" The room did not explode, it simply went very still, the way a battlefield goes still in the instant before the artillery starts walking. For 2 years, the entire Allied strategy in the Pacific had been built around the doctrine that fortresses had to be taken or neutralized. Leapfrogging had been discussed, but always as a theoretical luxury for later, after the main enemy bases were crushed. Now, with Tarawa's blood still wet on the sand, the luxury had become a necessity. Across the table, Rear Admiral Charles Sock McMorris, Nimitz's chief of staff, pushed the Rabaul planning folder to the center. "If we leave 110,000 Japanese in our rear," he said slowly, "they can still sortie against our supply lines. They can still fly raids against any new base we build. We can't just wish them away." Sherman looked at the map again, then at the casualty charts, then at the reconnaissance photographs showing the new airfields the Japanese were completing at Rabaul every month. Finally, he asked the question that changed everything. Why attack a fortress when you can starve it? The sentence hung in the humid air like incense. No one answered immediately, because no one had ever seriously considered the alternative. Starve it, contain it, bypass it, treat the strongest fortress in the Pacific as if it were already a museum piece. The idea violated every instinct drilled into generations of officers. Close with the enemy, destroy his main force, occupy his capital. Yet the math was merciless. Tarawa had proved that the Japanese would now die in place rather than retreat. Rabaul would be Tarawa magnified 100-fold. And for what? To capture 5 airfields that would be useless the moment American carriers moved 1,000 miles closer to Japan? That night, in his quarters, Admiral Nimitz sat alone with the Tarawa photographs and a single sheet of notepaper. He wrote 3 names: MacArthur, Halsey, Spruance. Then he drew a heavy line across the Solomon Sea, bypassing Rabaul entirely, and wrote a single sentence beneath it. Neutralization by air and submarine is strategically acceptable if casualties can be held below 5,000 total. 2 days later, in a secure radio exchange that was classified above top secret, Nimitz and MacArthur agreed on a new directive. Operation Cartwheel, the converging advance on Rabaul, would continue, but the final objective was no longer the capture of Rabaul itself. Instead, Allied forces would seize the Admiralty Islands, the western tip of New Britain, and the Treasury Islands, building airfields within bomber range of Rabaul, but outside the range of its fighters. The noose would tighten slowly. Carrier strikes would hammer the airfields. Submarines would prowl the shipping lanes. And the fortress, for all its tunnels and guns and 110,000 determined men, would be left to wither. On the evening the decision was made, a young Marine lieutenant who had survived Bedio's Red Beach II sat on the fantail of a transport ship bound for Guadalcanal. He was writing a letter he was not sure he would ever mail. "We thought Tarawa was the worst thing we would ever see," he wrote. "Now they tell us the next one will be 10 times worse. I don't know if I can do it again." He never had to. Far away, inside the cool darkness of a command tunnel under Tarawa volcano, General Imamura received fresh intelligence reports showing increased American activity in the Solomon Islands. He studied the maps, noted the pattern, and allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans were still coming, exactly as expected. Soon they would mass for the great assault. Soon the decisive battle would begin. He had no idea that the decisive battle had already been fought in a quiet room at Pearl Harbor, with nothing more lethal than pencils and casualty tables. What if the deadliest battle never had to be fought at all? December 1943. The rains came early to the Solomon Sea, turning every airstrip into mud and every foxhole into a bath. On Bougainville, the largest and northernmost of the Solomon Islands, 14,000 men of the 3rd Marine Division and the Army's 37th Infantry Division waded ashore at Empress Augusta Bay under a sky the color of wet slate. They expected another Tarawa. Instead, they met only scattered resistance from a Japanese rearguard that had orders to delay, not die. Within 10 days, the beachhead was secure, and Seabees were already bulldozing jungle to make room for 2 fighter strips and a bomber field at Cape Torokina. 240 miles away, inside the Rabaul perimeter, the news arrived like a slap. General Imamura stared at the map in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Bougainville was supposed to be a sideshow, a feint at best. Yet the Americans were not leaving. They were digging in. They were building airfields. And those airfields, when finished, would place every runway at Rabaul within easy reach of medium bombers and long-range fighters. Imamura turned to his chief of staff and spoke the first words that betrayed real doubt. "They are closer than we planned." The Japanese response was immediate and ferocious. On the night of 1 November, 3 heavy and 2 light cruisers, escorted by destroyers, raced down the slot to smash the beachhead while it was still fragile. They were met by Rear Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill's Task Force 39. In the confused, lightning-lit Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, Japanese torpedoes missed, American radar-directed 5-inch guns did not, and the Imperial Navy retreated south with 2 damaged cruisers and no victory. A week later, on 11th November, Admiral Koga tried again with 7 heavy cruisers. This time, Admiral Halsey sent the new fast carriers Saratoga and Princeton. 97 American aircraft caught the Japanese force at dawn off Rabaul itself. When the smoke cleared, 6 of the 7 heavy cruisers were crippled or burning. The Imperial Navy never again risked major surface units that far forward. The ring was tightening. By Christmas 1943, the first P-40 fighters of the 49th Fighter Group were operating from Torokina. On New Year's Day 1944, B-25 Mitchells flew their inaugural mission against Rabaul's airfields. The raids were small at first, almost experimental, but they never stopped. Day after day, week after week, bombers appeared overhead with the regularity of the monsoon. Japanese fighters rose to meet them and were shot from the sky in disproportionate numbers. American losses were light, Japanese losses were catastrophic. 0 pilots who had trained for 2 years to fight the decisive battle discovered that their decisive battles now lasted exactly 6 minutes, the time it took for a Hellcat to climb, dive, and disappear. Below the volcano, the mood inside the tunnels began to change. Pilots returned to revetments littered with the burning skeletons of aircraft that would never fly again. Mechanics cannibalized parts from wrecks to keep a dwindling number of fighters airworthy. Fuel, once measured in hundreds of thousands of gallons, was rationed to a few precious drums. General Imamura issued an order that every pilot must now score at least 1 confirmed kill before being allowed more than 2 sorties per month. The young men who had dreamed of glory began to understand that glory required an enemy willing to stand and fight on equal terms. On the sea lanes, the noose tightened further. American submarines, freed from the cautious doctrines of 1942, prowled the approaches to Simpson Harbor like wolves around a corral. The 5,000-ton transport Havana Maru was torpedoed on the 3rd of January. The 7,000-ton freighter Yoshida Maru went down a week later. By February, convoys from Truk had virtually ceased. Rice that had been expected in March never arrived. The sweet potato gardens on the crater slopes, once a contingency, became the primary source of calories for 110,000 men. Yet still the Japanese command believed the Americans would come. Every raid, every submarine contact, every new airfield spotted on Bougainville was interpreted as preparation for the great amphibious assault. Imamura reinforced the beaches that no one intended to use. Engineers deepened tunnels that would never be bombed hard enough to matter. Coastal guns were cleaned and recalibrated for targets that never appeared. The fortress mentality hardened into something close to religious faith. The enemy must attack here, because this is where we are strongest. In March 1944, the U.S. 14th Corps landed unopposed on the Treasury Islands and at Tarawa on New Britain's western tip. In April, the 1st Marine Division went ashore at Tarawa, halfway up the coast from Rabaul. None of these landings aimed at Rabaul itself. They were simply stepping stones for more airfields. Each new strip brought heavier bombers closer. Each raid stripped away more of Rabaul's air cover. By May, the once mighty air armada, that had terrorized the Solomons in 1942 was reduced to fewer than 50 serviceable aircraft. Inside the perimeter, the psychological strain became palpable. Soldiers who had spent 2 years preparing for a single apocalyptic battle now spent their days watching the empty sea. Sentries on the cliffs reported nothing but flying fish and rain squalls. Gun crews stood 4-hour watches over beaches where the only footprints were their own. In the deeper tunnels, where the air was always damp and smelled of mold and kerosene, men began to speak in whispers about the silence. No landing craft, no pre-invasion bombardment, no Marines storming the wire, only the daily drone of engines overhead and the occasional crump of bombs falling on airfields that were already craters. General Imamura walked the tunnels one evening in June. He passed ammunition boxes that would never be opened, hospital beds that would never see an American bullet wound, and rows of 75mm anti-aircraft shells stacked like firewood. A young lieutenant saluted and asked, with the polite desperation of a man clinging to doctrine, "Sir, when do you think they will come?" Imamura looked at the boy's earnest face and could not bring himself to say what he now believed. "They are already here. They have been here for months, and they have no intention of walking into our trap." That night, on the far side of the Bismarck Sea, construction lights burned at the new bomber base on Green Island. B-24 Liberators were already arriving, their bellies full of 1,000-pound bombs, reserved exclusively for Rabaul's remaining airfields and harbor facilities. The encirclement was complete. The fortress had become an island unto itself, surrounded not by water, but by American air power. The fortress was complete, so was the trap. February 16, 1944. The Japanese combined fleet anchorage at Truk Lagoon lay under a dawn so calm the water looked like polished steel. Sailors on the flight decks of the fleet carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku were still drinking their morning tea when the first air raid sirens began to wail. They thought it was another drill. Then the sky tore open. Operation Hailstone was the moment the Pacific War stopped pretending to be fair. Admiral Mark Mitscher's Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, a swarm of cruisers and destroyers, had approached during the night at 28 knots, invisible in the rain squalls. At 0550, the first wave of 72 Hellcat fighters swept over the lagoon at wave-top height. They caught the Japanese combat air patrol still on the ground, engines cold. In the first 10 minutes, 50 Japanese aircraft were destroyed before they cleared the revetments. By the time the second wave arrived with dive bombers and torpedo planes, there was nothing left in the air to oppose them. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. For 48 hours, the lagoon became a cauldron. The light carrier Zuiho took 3 torpedoes and rolled over like a tired animal. The 19,000-ton auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru exploded with such violence that fragments were later found on Dublon Island 4 miles away. Destroyers zigzagged desperately, throwing up walls of spray, only to vanish beneath avalanches of 1,000-pound bombs. Merchant ships loaded with aviation fuel and crated aircraft were hit again and again until the water itself seemed to burn. When the last American plane departed on the evening of 17th of February, the Imperial Navy had lost 2 light carriers, 4 destroyers, 3 cruisers, 8 oilers, 29 merchant ships, and 275 aircraft. More than 4,000 sailors and civilian mariners were dead. Truk, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, the forward fleet base that had anchored the entire Japanese defensive arc, was finished in 2 days. And Rabaul felt every blow like a hammer on its own coffin lid. Truk had been the logistical heart that kept Rabaul alive. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every replacement zero, every sack of rice that reached Simpson Harbor had come through the lagoon. When Truk burned, the pipeline was severed forever. The effect was immediate and merciless. In March 1944, Rabaul received exactly 1 convoy, 3 small coasters escorted by 2 sub-chasers. 2 were sunk by American submarines before they cleared the St. George's Channel. The third arrived with 400 tons of rice and 200 drums of aviation gas. It was the last surface supply run of the war. Inside the fortress, the arithmetic became brutal. 110,000 men required roughly 150 tons of food per day to maintain combat efficiency. The sweet potato gardens and taro patches on the volcanic slopes were already producing at maximum capacity, yet they yielded less than half the needed calories. Pilots who had once flown 3 sorties a day now walked because there was no fuel. Coastal guns that had been designed to sink battleships were stripped of their breech blocks and sent to the scrap pile to be melted into cooking pots. The great 14-inch guns in their cliffside caves, weapons that could have thrown a shell 30 miles, sat silent because the ammunition hoists had no electricity and the crews had no strength to manhandle 1,400-pound projectiles by hand. The silence was the worst part. Every morning the sentries still climbed to their posts overlooking Blanche Bay. Every evening they scanned an empty horizon. The expected armada never appeared. Instead, the only visitors were the daily flights of B-24s and B-25s that came in perfect formation, dropped their loads on the airfields, and turned for home without ever descending below 15,000 feet. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners learned to conserve ammunition the way drowning men conserve breath. They fired only when the bombers were directly overhead, and even then only in short, desperate bursts. Most days, they simply watched the sky and waited for the whistle of bombs that always found the last cluster of serviceable aircraft. In the tunnels, the air grew heavier. Kerosene ran out. Candles were rationed to 1 per squad per night. Men began to sleep in shifts because there was not enough room for everyone to lie down at once. Malaria, dengue, and beriberi moved through the bunkers like slow poison. The hospital cavern, designed for battlefield casualties, filled instead with swollen legs and hollow eyes. Doctors performed amputations with carpenter saws, sterilized in boiling water heated over fires made from ammunition boxes. A 22-year-old Zero pilot named Saburo Sakai, one of the few aces still alive, kept a diary in the margin of his navigation charts. In April 1944 he wrote, "Today we saw 12 enemy bombers. No one took off. We have no fuel, no spare parts, no hope. The Americans fly so high we cannot reach them. They do not even bother to shoot back anymore. They simply drop their bombs and leave. I think they are laughing at us." General Imamura walked the tunnels less and less. When he did, the men noticed that he no longer corrected posture or uniform. He simply passed through the gloom like a ghost, inspecting his own mausoleum. In May, he issued an order that revealed the depth of the collapse. Every unit was to begin manufacturing salt from seawater and weaving sandals from rice straw rope. The 8th Area Army, once the strongest formation in the South Pacific, was being reduced to subsistence farming inside its own fortress. Far away, American planners watched the reconnaissance photographs with clinical satisfaction. The airfields at Rabaul were cratered moonscapes. The harbor was littered with the ribs of sunken ships. No radar trace showed more than a handful of aircraft airborne at any one time. In June 1944, Admiral Halsey sent a single sarcastic radio message in plain language, knowing Japanese monitors would pick it up. "Tell Imamura the rent is due on Rabaul. Payment in blood will no chup." No reply ever came. By August, the daily bomber missions were reduced to nuisance raids flown by whatever aircraft happened to be in the area. Rabaul had ceased to be a military factor. It was simply a large prison whose guards and inmates were the same men. One night in September, a Japanese sergeant stood watch on a cliff above the bay. The moon was full, turning the water silver. He lit his last cigarette, cupped the glow in his hand the way he had been taught 2 years earlier, and stared at the empty sea. Somewhere inside his chest, the realization finally settled. The war had moved on without them. 100,000 Japanese soldiers were ready for war. War simply chose not to arrive. August 15, 1945. The Emperor's voice, thin and reedy, crackled over a single radio receiver deep inside Tunnel 17 beneath Tarawa volcano. For the first time in 2.5 years, the tunnels were completely silent. No generators coughed, no ventilation fans whirred, no boots echoed on concrete. 110,000 men, those who could still stand, crowded around that one speaker and listened to their sovereign tell them the war was over. There were no cheers, no tears, no collapse, only the soft rustle of uniforms as men sat down exactly where they were and stared at nothing. General Hitoshi Imamura heard the broadcast in his command bunker. He remained motionless for a long time, then removed his cap, placed it on the map table, and bowed once to the north, toward Tokyo. After that he walked the tunnels alone, passing rows of soldiers who came to attention out of reflex, even though their uniforms hung on skeletal frames and their eyes were ringed black with beriberi. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the volcano still smoked gently, exactly as it had every day since 1942. The great coastal guns pointed at an ocean that had never brought the enemy. The airfields were weed-choked craters. The beaches were pristine, the wire uncut, the minefields undisturbed. Rabaul had survived the war untouched by everything except its own irrelevance. In the end, fewer than 500 men of the 8th Area Army had died in combat against Americans after January 1944. The rest, almost 7,000, were claimed by starvation, malaria, and the slow rot of purposelessness. They died in hospital caverns that smelled of iodine and excrement, whispering apologies to photographs of wives and mothers they would never see again. The fortress that was supposed to break the American advance had instead become the largest Japanese cemetery in the South Pacific. On September 7, 1945, Australian troops of the 4th Infantry Brigade landed unopposed at Rabaul to accept the formal surrender. They expected resistance, or at least sullen hostility. Instead, they found men who moved like sleepwalkers. A Japanese officer presented his sword with both hands, bowed, and asked in perfect English whether the Australians required rice. The Australians did not know whether to laugh or weep. The surrender ceremony took place on the flight deck of HMS Glory in Simpson Harbor. General Imamura, gaunt but ramrod straight, signed the instrument of capitulation with a fountain pen he had carried since his days in France. When it was over, he turned to the Australian commander, Lieutenant General Vernon Sturdy, and spoke quietly. "General, your country fought a very clever war. You never gave us the battle we prepared for." Sturdy, who had lost friends on the Kokoda track and knew exactly how brutal the war had been, simply nodded. There was nothing clever to say. In the decades that followed, the survivors returned to Rabaul as old men. They walked the tunnels again, now collapsed and overgrown with kunai grass, and tried to explain to their grandchildren what it felt like to spend 3 years waiting for an invasion that was canceled by a signature in Tokyo. Some left flowers at the mouths of caves where friends had starved. Others stood on the cliffs above Blanche Bay and stared at the same empty sea, still half expecting the gray shapes of transports on the horizon. Saburo Sakai, the ace pilot who had once ruled the skies over Guadalcanal, came back in 1972. He found the revetment where his Zero had been parked, now a garden of papaya trees. He sat on a fallen coconut log and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. A Japanese reporter asked what he felt. "I feel," Sakai said, "like a man who trained his entire life for a duel, arrived at the appointed place at dawn, and discovered that his opponent had already won the war somewhere else." The strategic lesson was mercilessly simple, and it rewrote every military textbook written after 1945. A fortress is only strong against the attack it is designed to repel. When the enemy refuses to cooperate, the fortress becomes a trap for its own garrison. Rabaul, Truk, and a dozen lesser strongholds together absorbed more than 300,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, resources that could have been used to defend the Philippines, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. Instead, they sat in their tunnels and waited for a war that had already passed them by. American planners took the lesson to heart. In Korea, they bypassed Wonsan. In Vietnam, they never assaulted the DMZ head-on. In the Cold War, they built carrier battle groups and nuclear submarines instead of Maginot Lines. Mobility, air dominance, and the ability to choose the point of decision became the new orthodoxy. The age of the fixed fortress died in the damp tunnels under a smoking volcano in the Bismarck Sea. Years later, an American historian asked Admiral Raymond Spruance, the quiet architect of so much of the Central Pacific Campaign, whether he ever worried about leaving 110,000 armed Japanese in his rear. Spruance thought for a moment, then gave the answer that belongs on the gravestone of every static defense since 1944. Worried? No. They were exactly where I wanted them, out of my way. Rabaul stands today as vines reclaim the gun emplacements and coral grows over the wrecks in the harbor. Tourists come to dive the sunken ships and walk the silent tunnels. They ask the guides why no great battle was ever fought here. The guides shrug and tell the truth. Because someone, somewhere, looked at the casualty estimates, looked at the map, and decided that the most powerful weapon in the Pacific was not a battleship or a division of Marines. It was an idea. A fortress with no enemy is just a tomb. 110,000 troops cannot stop a strategy they were never trained to counter. Real strength is mobility, and the greatest victories are the ones you never need to fight. In the end, America won the Pacific War by refusing, absolutely refusing, to fight the battle Japan had spent decades preparing for. Subscribe for more stories where ideas changed the war more than any weapon.